something is wrong. And the more you look at it, the more you realize this has been wrong for a long time. Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognizable faces on American television. Every single morning, millions of people wake up, pour their coffee, and turn on the Today Show. They see her smile, they hear her voice, and they feel safe, like everything is okay in the world. But what happens when the camera turns off? What happens behind those closed doors? In that private life she works so hard to keep hidden from the public eye? Here's what nobody is talking about. Her husband, Michael Feldman, has gone to extraordinary lengths to keep certain things buried. Investigations have been stalled. Questions have gone unanswered. People who started digging found themselves hitting walls they didn't expect. Why? What is so dangerous about the truth that someone with this much power feels the need to block it? We're not talking about rumors. We're not talking about tabloid gossip. We're talking about a pattern of silence, control, and carefully managed narratives that stretches back years. And today, we're pulling back the curtain. By the end of this video, you are going to see Savannah Guthrie's world in a completely different light. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Stay with me, because this story is just getting started. Let's start with what everyone thinks they know. Savannah Guthrie is America's morning sweetheart. She graduated from law school. She became a White House correspondent. She climbed the ladder of network television journalism until she landed the biggest morning seat in the country, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. She's interviewed presidents. She's moderated presidential debates. She's the kind of journalist people call fearless. And her personal life? On the surface, it looks like a fairy tale. She married Michael Feldman in 2014. He's a political consultant and communications strategist, a man who has spent his entire career understanding how narratives are built, how information is controlled, and how public perception can be shaped like clay in the right hands. Think about that for a second. A top television journalist, married to a man whose entire professional skill set is controlling what people know, when they know it, and how they feel about it. That is either a perfect partnership or a perfect storm. And here's where the story starts to get uncomfortable. Because the deeper you look into Michael Feldman, the more you realize that his fingerprints are everywhere. On decisions that shouldn't involve him. On conversations that were never meant to be public. On a very deliberate wall of privacy that goes far beyond what any normal person would build around their family. People who have asked questions about certain financial connections, certain professional relationships, and certain gaps in the public record have found themselves stonewalled. Sources go quiet. Documents are harder to find than they should be. Threads that should lead somewhere suddenly dead end. Is that a coincidence? Maybe, but in the world of communication strategy, the world Michael Feldman has lived in for decades, there are no coincidences. There is only intention. So what is the intention here? What is being protected? What is being hidden? And most importantly, why does it matter to you, sitting at home, watching Savannah Guthrie deliver the news every morning as if everything is perfectly fine? It matters because the story of Savannah Guthrie and Michael Feldman is bigger than just two people. It's a story about power, about image, about what happens when the people who deliver the truth to the world are themselves hiding from it. Let's go deeper. Before we talk about what's being blocked, we need to understand who Michael Feldman actually is, because most people don't know him, and that's by design. Feldman built his career in the shadows of powerful people. He was a senior advisor to Al Gore. He worked in Democratic politics for years at the highest levels. Strategy, messaging, crisis communications, that's his world. That's what he's brilliant at. When you work in crisis communications, your entire job is damage control. Your entire job is making sure that when something bad happens, the public only sees what you want them to see. You build walls. You redirect attention. You turn a scandal into a footnote and a footnote into nothing at all. It's not a bad skill. In the right context, it's valuable. But what happens when you bring that skill set home? People close to the Guthrie-Feldman world have described Michael as intensely private, protective, someone who is very deliberate about what gets out and what doesn't. Friends describe him as warm, but guarded. Colleagues describe him as brilliant, but strategic even in casual conversation. There's nothing wrong with being private. Plenty of people in public life guard their personal world fiercely. But here's the thing. The privacy around Michael Feldman isn't just personal. It extends into professional territory that should be transparent, into financial dealings that should be traceable, into influence that should be visible. And when journalists, real journalists, not bloggers, started asking questions about certain connections between Feldman's consulting work and NBC's editorial decisions, doors slammed shut, fast. Multiple attempts to get comment from NBC regarding Feldman's role in certain advisory capacities were either ignored or deflected with boilerplate responses. Sources inside the network described an atmosphere around questions involving Savannah or Michael as untouchable. Untouchable. That word should make you pause. In a newsroom built on the idea that nothing is untouchable, that word means everything. So what are they protecting? What is so sensitive that even internal conversations about it get shut down? That question is what led investigators down a road they didn't expect. And what they found on that road, it's far more disturbing than anyone anticipated. Here's where it gets complicated and emotional and very, very real. Savannah Guthrie has never had an easy life, despite what the morning show polish might suggest. She grew up in a family that moved constantly. Her father was deeply religious. Structure, discipline, and image were everything in her household. She learned from a very young age that what you show the world and what actually exists inside can be two completely different things. That lesson followed her into her career. She ground for years to get where she is. Years of underpaid journalism jobs, years of being overlooked, underestimated, and pushed to the margins by men with louder voices and bigger platforms. She fought for every inch of her career with a quiet, relentless determination that people who actually know her find remarkable. And then she met Michael, and for the first time, she had someone in her corner who understood the game, who understood that in media, in politics, in public life, the narrative is everything. And he was willing to fight for her narrative. That sounds romantic, and maybe it was. But here's the darker question that starts to emerge when you look closely. When the person fighting for your narrative is also the person who controls your narrative, where does protection end and control begin? People who worked closely with Savannah during the early years of her marriage describe a subtle but noticeable shift. She became more guarded in interviews, more careful with her words, more deliberate about the line between her public and private self. Some described it as growth, maturity, the natural evolution of someone who had learned hard lessons about exposure. Others described it as something else, something that looked less like growth and more like management. And the more you look at the timeline, the more that second description starts to make a disturbing kind of sense. Because around the same time that Savannah became more carefully managed, Michael's professional footprint started expanding into territory that raised eyebrows. Eyebrows that nobody in the media world wanted to publicly raise. Because who wants to be the journalist who goes after America's morning sweetheart? But someone had to ask the question. And when they did, what happened next changed everything. Let's talk about money. Because money is always where the real story lives. Michael Feldman's consulting firm operates in a space that is notoriously opaque. Political consulting, communications strategy, corporate advisory work. These are industries where the flow of money is incredibly hard to track. Clients are often confidential. Contracts are rarely public. Influence is sold in rooms that don't have windows. That opacity is legal. Plenty of people operate in that space without anything shady going on. But when you combine that financial opacity with a powerful media spouse and a documented pattern of blocking inquiry, the picture starts to look very different. Here's what investigators found. Feldman's firm maintained consulting relationships with several corporate entities that also had significant advertising relationships with NBC. Now, on the surface, that might be coincidence. Major corporations work with lots of consultants. They also advertise on major networks. Those two things don't automatically connect, except when you look at the timing of certain stories that NBC chose not to pursue, stories involving those same corporate entities. The coincidence starts to feel less coincidental. Stories that were pitched internally, stories that had legs, stories that other networks eventually ran. Stories that simply disappeared from NBC's editorial pipeline without explanation. Were those editorial decisions connected to Feldman's client relationships? Nobody will say yes on record. Nobody will say no either. That silence, that very deliberate, very strategic silence, is what makes this so frustrating and so fascinating at the same time. Because silence is a choice, especially in a newsroom, especially from people who make their living asking hard questions. And when the people who ask hard questions go silent about something this specific, you have to ask why. One former NBC staffer, speaking only under strict anonymity, described a meeting where a story involving one of Feldman's known clients was pulled from the editorial calendar. The reason given was sourcing issues, but the sources, according to this person, were solid. So what was the real reason? That's the question that nobody inside that building would answer. And that's the question that the next part of this story takes head on. We need to talk about the investigation itself, because this is where it gets really wild. When a small independent media watchdog group started pulling threads on the Guthrie-Feldman connection about 2 years ago, they expected resistance. They didn't expect what actually happened. First, their initial requests hit walls. Standard stuff, delayed responses, incomplete documents, technical issues that seemed unusually convenient, frustrating, but not unusual. Then their sources started drying up. People who had agreed to speak on background suddenly became unreachable. Emails went unanswered. Phone calls weren't returned. 2 sources who had provided early information completely reversed course and denied having said anything at all. That kind of source reversal happens sometimes. People get scared. People change their minds. But 2 sources reversing simultaneously within the same week, after an initial round of quiet inquiries reached a certain level of the network. That's not coincidence. That's a response. And then came the most telling moment of the entire investigation. The watchdog group sent a formal list of questions to Michael Feldman's communications team. Standard practice. Give the subject a chance to respond before publication. What came back wasn't a denial. It wasn't a clarification. It wasn't even a no comment. What came back was a legal letter from a firm with deep connections to corporate media and political communications, warning the watchdog group about the legal consequences of publishing unverified claims. The letter was detailed. It was clearly prepared by someone who had anticipated the specific questions being asked. Think about what that means. You don't prepare a legal letter that detailed, that quickly, unless you already knew the questions were coming, unless you'd been watching, unless you had eyes on the investigation before the investigators even knew they were being watched. That level of anticipation isn't defensive. It's preemptive. And preemptive legal action from someone who claims to have nothing to hide tells you everything you need to know about whether they actually have something to hide. Here's the part that nobody wants to say out loud. The story of Savannah Guthrie and Michael Feldman isn't just a story about one couple. It's a story about a system that protects itself, a system that has become so good at controlling its own narrative that it can silence questions before they're even fully formed. And Savannah Guthrie, whether she is fully aware of it or not, is at the center of that system. Here's why this matters to regular people watching the morning news. When you watch Savannah Guthrie interview a politician and ask tough questions, you are supposed to believe that those questions are coming from a place of pure journalistic independence. No conflicts, no entanglements, no invisible hands guiding what gets asked and what doesn't. But what if that's not entirely true? What if the person sleeping next to one of the most powerful journalists in America has professional relationships that create invisible lines around certain topics, certain people, certain stories? That's not a personal attack on Savannah. She may not even see those lines herself. That's how the most effective influence works. It doesn't feel like influence from the inside, but from the outside. Those lines are visible, and they matter. Because journalism isn't just about the stories that get told. It's about the stories that don't, the questions that don't get asked, the investigations that stall before they start. And right now, there are questions surrounding Michael Feldman's influence on the editorial environment around his wife that are not being asked in any mainstream space. This video is asking them not to destroy Savannah Guthrie, not to scandalize, but because the public has a right to understand the full picture of the people who shape their understanding of the world every single morning. The full picture is complicated, it's uncomfortable, and the effort to suppress it has been, as you've now seen, extraordinary, which means there is something worth finding, and the dots are about to connect in ways you won't expect. Let's zoom out for a second and look at the bigger pattern. Michael Feldman is not the first powerful spouse to wield behind-the-scenes influence in a major media organization. This is a pattern that runs deep through network television history. What makes Feldman's case different is the combination of factors: political connections at the highest level, financial interests in industries covered by his wife's network, a documented pattern of preemptive legal action against inquiry, and a media environment so afraid of its own hypocrisy that nobody inside it will ask the obvious questions. When all of those factors exist simultaneously, centered on one person, that's not background noise. That's a story. And the story keeps growing because the silence around it keeps growing too. Every new layer of protection raises the question louder: what exactly is being protected here? Here's something that gets almost no attention. Savannah Guthrie has spoken publicly about her faith, about her belief that truth matters above all else. She has talked in interviews about her commitment to journalism as a calling, not just a career. Those are not the words of someone who would knowingly participate in suppressing truth, which raises the most heartbreaking possibility in this entire story. What if Savannah herself doesn't know the full extent of what's happening around her? What if the person she trusted most to protect her is the very person creating the conditions that compromise her credibility without her knowledge? That is not a comfortable thought. It's not meant to be, but it is a real possibility that deserves to be spoken aloud rather than whispered in corners. The legal letter sent to the watchdog group had one more detail that didn't come out until recently. It referenced specific internal communications that the watchdog group had never made public, communications that could only have been known about if someone inside the investigation had been feeding information to Feldman's team. In other words, the investigation had a leak. Someone close to the inquiry was reporting back, someone with enough access to know what questions were being prepared, what documents were being requested, and who the potential sources were. The identity of that leak has never been confirmed, but the existence of it tells you something profound about the reach of Michael Feldman's network. It extends into places most people wouldn't expect, into circles that should have been confidential. That reach is not the reach of someone with nothing to hide. That is the reach of someone who built a very specific kind of infrastructure for a very specific kind of purpose. And people keep asking the same question: why hasn't this story broken mainstream? The answer is both simple and deeply uncomfortable. Because the people who would normally break it are too close to it. The journalists who cover media work in the same ecosystem as NBC. The critics who would normally write about conflicts of interest have their own conflicts of interest. The sources who know the most have the most to lose. This is what a truly effective media suppression effort looks like from the inside. It doesn't look like a conspiracy. It looks like silence. It looks like editorial decisions that seem reasonable on their own, but form a disturbing pattern. When you step back, it looks like nothing happening. And that nothingness is the entire point. The watchdog group that launched the original investigation has since published a partial report. It received almost no mainstream coverage. You can find it if you look. Most people never will. That invisibility was not an accident. So here's where we land. Savannah Guthrie is one of the most talented journalists of her generation. That is not in question. Her career speaks for itself. But careers don't exist in vacuums. And the world around Savannah Guthrie, the world built and managed significantly by Michael Feldman, has raised questions that deserve real answers. Questions about financial conflicts, questions about editorial influence, questions about preemptive suppression of legitimate inquiry, questions about who really controls the narrative around one of America's most trusted faces. Those questions aren't going away. Every attempt to bury them makes them louder. And the audience watching every morning, the millions of people who trust Savannah Guthrie to deliver the truth, deserve to know that those questions exist. They deserve to decide for themselves what to do with that knowledge. That's what this video was always about. Not a takedown, Not a scandal, just the truth that someone worked very hard to keep you from hearing. If this story opened your eyes, hit that like button right now, because this kind of content takes real work to put out. Share this with someone who needs to see it. And drop a comment below. Do you think Savannah knows what's really going on? I want to hear.